everyone to an Ideas for India conversation. I'm Lakshmi Iyer. I'm a professor of economics and global affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And today's topic is decentralization. And it is a very great pleasure to have with us Sarmistha Pal, who is a professor of economics at the University of Surrey in the UK, and Jean-Paul Faguet, who is a professor of political economy at the London School of Economics. Sarmistha and JP have just published a new edited volume entitled Decentralized Governance, Crafting Effective Democracies Around the World. And obviously our conversation is going to be centered around the issues discussed in the book. So Sarmistha and JP, thanks so much for making time for this Ideas for India conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
It's a pleasure to be here with you and with all the listeners.
So let's start right at the beginning. What does decentralized governance mean?
Maybe I'll kick off. Summarizing hugely, when I think about decentralized governance, I think about the quality of democracy in democratic systems, and I think of the quality of public decision-making and resource allocation in non-democratic systems. So maybe it helps to back up a little bit. When we talk about decentralization, we're talking about devolving combinations of resources and power or authority from higher to lower levels of government, from the center to regions and or municipalities, for example. That's a change in the system that then settles down. So then governance is how that system then settles down and how decisions are taken and the quality of services and policy and government that is provided ex post.
Mm-hmm. And before we get into both the theory and the empirical facts about how this process works, I just want to get some facts from you. What is the current global status of decentralization? Which are the examples of some of the most decentralized countries and which are some of the least? This is just so that listeners can understand what it means to be a decentralized governance system.
And the status of decentralization is that it's something that has been on in the world, in the policy world. It's been happening in developed and developing countries for the last 50 years. It's a wave that's been growing in size from the 70s through the 80s through the 90s. I started studying it way back in the 1990s and thought the wave must be cresting. We must be reaching peak decentralization. And to my surprise, the wave kept building, such that just in the last few years, something like 35 countries have announced new or deepening decentralization reforms. So to give you ideas of the breadth of countries that are doing it, some of the most decentralized countries in the world are India, Brazil, the US, and Germany, just to pick 4 countries that are big, important, prominent countries that are highly decentralized. Some of the least decentralized countries in the world, North Korea is one extreme example. Russia, which formally is decentralized, but in practice is not. If you read the constitution, it looks very decentralized, but the way that decisions are taken, the way that power flows, it's not. A very different kind of country, the UK, has this very funny asymmetric devolution where the Scots have relatively more power than the Welsh or the Northern Irish. But then the largest bit of the country, which is England, actually has very little devolved government. It has a few cities that have some sui generis kinds of arrangements, but there are no English regions, for example, that have any sort of. But Sarmistha can come in with more.
Yes, I just like to add that, with the wave of authoritarianism coming in, we see a kind of trend towards decentralization in some countries. We have seen in Tanzania, for example, that there has been a cut, there has been a decision to move the revenue raising powers of the local units into the central government hands again. So it's a kind of trend towards decentralization. We have actually seen in India, there has been a growing trend to, towards limiting the federation powers. We have seen that, but what has happened in India constitutionally, there are all these states who had allocated some functions and they get some revenue raising power, but Also, if their revenue raising power is not enough to cover all their functions, all their spending, then they get the center state financial transfers, which are overlooked by some finance commissions and dictated by some rules from time to time. But the finance commission is not an independent body. It's really under the control of the central government. And what we have seen, particularly since 2017, with the initiation of the GST, or the goods and services tax, we have found that the power of the state to tax locally is being curtailed. There also has been a disproportionate amount of central revenues being held by the central government, and states are getting less and less.
So it's very interesting that the globe seems to be in flux on this matter, right? So there are many, as you say, decentralization initiatives, and maybe some countries having re-centralization initiatives. So I want to get to one of the most fascinating parts of the book, which is that you have synthesized a very large theoretical and empirical literature on decentralization. As you say, this process has happened over the last 4 or 5 decades, and the literature also is equally long. And so that was, I think, great service to all readers to synthesize this large literature. But can you explain a little bit what are the new theoretical insights that are highlighted in the book?
Oh, that's difficult. There's a great deal. The book has a lot of original empirical chapters, 13 original chapters by some of the leading authorities. So I can't really summarize.
No, you could pick 2 or 3. Pick 2 or 3. You don't have to summarize the whole book. People should go and read this book, and we're going to put a link to the book. It is available for free download by the LSE Press, and so it's made very accessible to everybody.
Sure, absolutely, fair enough. So some of the big themes are that decentralization is inherently political, and so when you go back to the literature of the 1980s and 90s, it was very public economics and very public policy technocratic, looking at what were the marginal effects of locating a certain spending authority at one level or another level on things like education enrollment or unit costs in transportation infrastructure, for example. And what we've realized is that from the beginning to the end, and this is a big point that Shanta Devarajan and Stuti Khemani make in chapter 4, decentralization is inherently political from the beginning to the end. So the decision to decentralize in the first place is not done by people like us sitting around a conversation like this or in a seminar room at Notre Dame or the LSE, deciding that we want to decentralize, but rather it's done in service to some sort of immediate political imperative to keep a coalition together, to try to undermine the opposition, to reach some other goal, which is political in nature. And that maps onto the way in which the decentralization is done. And then the process of decentralization itself goes through different levels of government and through bureaucrats and public servants who, by definition, have to give up power, authority, and resources to other people that they don't control. And that itself is a fundamentally political act. So from the decision to decentralize, from the way in which it's designed, and then to the way in which it's implemented or not, these are deeply political issues. And so the different chapters look at that from different points of view, at the effects that it has on political stability at the national level, or on the selection of local leaders, on the ways in which it gives voice to or takes away voice from different ethnic or religious or other sorts of subsets of people in countries. So looking at this as an explicitly political thing, which is something that economists don't naturally do. It doesn't come naturally to them. But to really understand how decentralization works, you have to do that.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, economists have been looking at all these economic efficiency arguments or effects of decentralization. Is it economically efficient? Is it good for this economic outcome or that economic outcome? But you're saying it's actually a fundamentally political process, and we should not be ignoring that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, even arguably start there, or at least take account of it in any kind of estimation that you try to do.
That's right. So maybe we have been going on the wrong track for all of these years.
It was the elephant, politics was the elephant in the room that was just not acknowledged in the vast majority of literally hundreds of studies that have been published.
That's very interesting. So I think your book is providing a very useful corrective to this view and urging us to take these political processes into account.
So that's one of the fundamental thing. But there are some other chapters there also we look at some other interesting thing which has not been studied so well. One is the chapter by Amrita and others, Amrita Dhilan and others, that really looks at the theoretical basis of centralized versus decentralized monitoring of corruption, particularly because corruption can arise even in decentralized governments, decentralized economies. So they really try to find under what theoretical conditions one works better than other. And given the shortcomings of empirical studies in this respect, they could not guide us much towards the empirics, but what they find that under certain conditions is the centralized monitoring that works better, and under another set of conditions, the decentralized monitoring that works. So there is no thing that only decentralized monitoring will always work. And the third thing that I would add is that, we actually, a couple of chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7, that really looks at the role of ethnic homogeneity or ethnic diversity on the effectiveness of decentralization. And what the chapter by Gerard Padre, Miquel, and co-authors, they really show that in China is that, the communities, the local governments where there is more homogeneity, religious homogeneity, they are more efficient in public service delivery than where there is heterogeneity. In our paper, in chapter 7, my paper with Anirban, what we really find that in Indonesia, there are 3 types of leader selection in these communities. And so it could be by majority voting, it could be by consensus building, or it could be oligarchic, even after introduction of decentralization. So oligarchic is where the local leader is selected by the local elite or still by the central government. So what we find that it's usually the ethnically homogeneous communities are going for consensus building, whereas ethnically heterogeneous communities are going for voting. And then we really try to find, we really find that it's the voting communities which are essentially ethnically diverse, but they can still perform well if it can give rise to some kind of political entrepreneurship, and that raises income and development, and that ultimately align the diverse interests of the local people, which I think is quite an important finding, particularly in the current context where we see that this ethnic conflict all around the world, and there it can provide some scope of optimism. But it works only when there is political entrepreneurship, that there are some, given the increasing rent in office after decentralization, more political entrepreneurs can come for office, and if they can boost local income and local development, they can align the interests, diverse interests of the people, and it works better when economic inequality is low.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, right? That the same type of thing, which is how diverse a society is or how diverse the local population is, has different effects when you look at different countries, right? So it's I think that's the power of some of the case studies you have incorporated into this book. And I do want to point out that the book has empirical analysis from a very wide range of countries about their decentralization experiences. So if I'm going to read the list of countries, you have Pakistan, China, Indonesia, Kenya, India, Ghana, Bangladesh, and Colombia. This is a really wonderfully wide global sample. So I had some questions to you as editors. Once you have all these different chapters in front of you, what made you choose these particular countries, and what surprised you most after seeing the analysis which the various contributing authors have provided?
Okay. So, this is basically driven by the fact of the availability of local information. The empirical studies are always guided by the availability of local information, which is crucial for the functioning and greater accountability and transparency of the local government. But unfortunately, this is not always available, right? In your paper, you talk about the absence of local finance, local government finance in India. You know, I have been trying to do some work on India, and I have been hindered by the unavailability. So I believe that most of these studies are really driven by the cases where there are good local information available, either from primary service or from secondary service. Couple of chapters in the book really, collect their own survey data. Right. So both primary and secondary survey availability has made this analysis possible.
No, just to say that the countries that Lakshmi kindly mentioned, they're big, important countries that have their own importance. I mean, I think, that's right. The question. The other thing is really, as Sarmistha was saying, the availability of information. One of the big differences over the last 40 years is that from the mid to late 1990s onwards, we got the availability of new data sets at a much lower level and much more disaggregated data, with which we could do much more fine-tuned kinds of empirical studies than the previous generation of scholars had. So we can now ask and answer questions that people in the 80s, I'm sure they thought of these questions, but they had no way to attack them, and now we can. So we picked a confluence of big, important countries that map across a range of different kinds of outcomes by some of the leading authorities in the field, working with, usually in teams with young, brilliant scholars up and rising, sort of the next generation of experts.
Right. No, this is fantastic. As I said, the global scope of these chapters is quite amazing. So what surprised you the most for each of you from when you saw these different results? Like, when Sarmistha mentioned this contrast between the Indonesia case and the China case, that's absolutely fascinating. But what other wonderful things did you discover?
Yeah, okay. So let me just start first and JP can join later. So to me, what I find to my amazement is, in the chapter by Dilip Mukherjee, he mentions about this reform, this very innovative reform experiments that was introduced in order to tackle elite capture and clientelism in many parts of the world, including some important ones in India. And what he argues that, this was really facilitated by big data and also by new technology, biometric cards in India or Aadhaar cards in India, for example, while they were very successful to limit the leakage in the program transfer. But what he argues that it actually also this formula-based program transfers that actually increased the possibility of re-centralization, because that took away power from the elected local officials, and it has actually increasingly, it has been increasingly re-centralizing these programs. So, and so what he suggests in his chapter that, before introducing such program, these implications must be taken account of so as to limit this possibility, so that as the powers don't go back to the center government. There are other problems with these biometric cards and Aadhaar cards, because it depends on new technology and also this big data. And, in India particularly, he points out about the problem of integration between the Aadhaar cards and the food transfer programs. And that has actually, obstructed the receipt of these program benefits to the poor. A lot of the poor have not been able to get the benefits of it. And there are also problems of scaling up this program. So that's aside, but the re-centralization, possibility of re-centralization through this formula-based program transfers, private program transfers, is something quite surprising for me.
Let me jump in with a couple of things.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that completely surprised me that I had not known about until we started writing this book was in Padre et al.'s chapter on China, the existence of 700,000 elected local governments in China. In a communist dictatorship, they have locally elected governments in 700,000 different districts. And under this program, under this reform, the return of religion as a politically important dimension of social identity. So it turns out that in some towns, in some municipalities in China, religion becomes an organizing principle of the local society and determines political outcomes in a communist country. And the way in which you understand how decentralization is functioning, how public decision-making happens in China today is completely different because of that, compared to 30 years ago when they didn't have elected local, when you had decentralization, but it was more like deconcentration. It wasn't elected local governments, it was appointed local governments by the Communist Party, and the system operated under in a completely different way then. The second thing that really surprised me as part of this book is what we call mechanism design. So there's a great deal to successful governance that goes beyond politics. We talk about the importance of politics, and we begin with that. That's very important for understanding decentralization, but there's a great deal that goes beyond that. And so we ended up coining this phrase mechanism design to cover the confluence of different non-political, often technocratic elements, programs, or criteria by which resources are allocated, poor people are targeted, beneficiaries are determined, etc. And now I was aware of some of these things before the book, but not aware of many others that come up in the book. And this is something that Amrita and also Dilip Mukherjee in a brilliant chapter 3 surveys different examples of design that are having huge effects across the world. So, for example, in India, the use of biometric identification cards to verify employment beneficiaries, which in India has been shown to reduce leakage from ghosts by 41% across the whole country, which is just
huge.
It's huge, exactly. Elsewhere, non-elite citizens are being hired as monitors to beat down elite capture of public benefits in towns and municipalities, throughout huge rural areas. Dilip Mukherjee suggests the possibility, so he's sort of blue skies thinking, pulling together different elements that he surveyed, and he thinks we can imagine a synthesis of this where you have a big data approach that uses survey data like the Indian data, which is down to the individual level, not just towns or even families, but the individual level, to predict levels of poverty of each individual in a huge country like India, and then allocate benefits nationwide according to this biometric identification to target at incredibly low cost and with, in principle, at least with a very high degree of accuracy, which is the kind of thing that, has been unthinkable beforehand. And now we can start to think about this as a possibility.
Yeah, so these are absolutely fascinating insights, right? So I'm hearing two big things. One is, we talked about how decentralization could have different effects in different types of societies, right? And even the same factors work differently across different countries. But now I'm hearing something else, which is decentralization itself could change how societies organize, right? That's one thing, as you say, the return of religion as an organizing force, which was not there before. And that's because now you have local elections, you have to organize in a different way, or the Indonesian case, right? You have to now make a decision about whether to use voting or some kind of consensus building. And obviously both are going to shape societal interactions in different ways. So the decentralization itself shapes society. So, we had society shapes decentralization before, and now we are seeing this thing going in the opposite direction.
Exactly.
And the second thing which I'm hearing is that new technologies are opening up all kinds of new opportunities, right? And as you say, the opportunity to reduce corruption on a large scale, which is fantastic, but also raising brand new questions, which we could not even imagine before, right? So are there other things you would highlight that these insights are pointing to about, say, things for which we don't have theories about? Where should theorizing go next? And then, of course, the empirical work hopefully will follow, but this is like the back and forth, right? We have existing theories which have pointed out certain things. Then we have all these new facts from the ground. Now, what are the new things we need to theorize about?
Yes, so, this decentralization possibility as a result of this new technology and big data, perhaps, that really needs much more thinking. This is something just very new observation by Dilip Mukherjee, and, this, he himself agrees, and, this has not been studied. In the process of making decentralization effective, we are really innovating various things, and are we going back in the process? So that really needs to be understood very well. And the other thing I would probably say that, we were talking about this, the distinction between the trade-off between centralized and decentralized monitoring. And, that also needs to be understood, So, and whether, this, whether there are alternatives to new technology, so
Right.
centralized versus decentralized monitoring. And, that is also some area which is not very well developed, especially empirical. There are some theories, as Amrita and co-authors discuss in that chapter, but, these two, I think together, we really need to think about it. What are the other alternatives, to biometric cards or other cards? Can you improve the monitoring of these program transfers, private program transfers in some way or other? We know very little about this, and there is a gap in the literature which needs to be addressed.
Right, right.
I would add, James Heckman likes to say that in the long run, everything is endogenous. And so what you're getting at, your comments actually, is all of the multiple endogeneities and feedback loops that happen around decentralization. So society shapes how decentralization happens or how it's implemented. Political incentives shape the program, but then decentralization itself can change society by bringing, in China, religion as a salient political factor, something that nobody would have expected, as just one small example. So it seems to me that decentralization is bound in the medium term, if not the short term, but certainly the medium term, to change the nature of political cleavages, of political divisions, the way that the relevant dimensions of political organization, let's say, which then determines which parties and politicians will rise to the top in electoral competition and then wield power. We should expect decentralization to do that. So the older literature, until the early 2000s, literature kind of assumed that decentralization was a static, one-time political or policy change that would not change the political landscape and would not change the structure of the economy. So you were sort of changing resource allocation, but the rest of it was more or less fixed. I don't know that people necessarily believe that in their hearts, but it was a sort of a useful assumption, and the studies were structured in that way. And now what we realize is that even over periods of, say, 10 or 15 years, it's going to change the deep political identification. It's going to change the nature of politics. So let me give you an example. Bolivia decentralized in 1994. And then the entire political party system completely collapsed around 2003, 2004. And those parties are dead and gone forever. Not just those political parties, but an entire axis of competition that was left, pro-worker, pro-peasant, versus right, pro-business, pro-capital. That's gone. And the new politics that came in is what we all know about. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, that's true, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the iceberg is you got identity-based politics where left and right are kind of meaningless, because now it's who you are, where you're from, what language you speak, and which region of the country you come from. And have you been a son of the soil for 10,000 years or for 500 because you're there as of the Spanish conquest? That's and so it's reallocated people on the left and on the right into it. So it went from an axis that looked like this, dividing left from right, to an axis that looks like that, and cutting the electorate in a completely different way and completely changed the country forever.
Right, and in a relatively short span of time, right? So as you say, in the long run, everything is endogenous, but what you're saying is that the recent experiences have shown that that long run is not very long.
It doesn't have to be very long.
In the space of a decade or 2 decades, which is pretty short time to restructure society, so to speak, right? So I think I'm hearing from both of you that we really need to think about endogenizing a lot more things in our models, right? Thinking of more dynamic models. So there is the interplay, right? So new technology comes in, it makes decentralization better, but it may also lead to re-centralization, right? So I think we have to stop thinking of decentralization as a static one-time policy change and think of evolution of different stages of decentralization or something like that, and the possibility that it's endogenously determined in each time, right? So it changes society, and then society organizes a different way. they may demand different types of decentralization as a result, or even perhaps decentralization. And those are the theories we don't yet have. So I think this is what new empirical work is giving us, with directions to go theoretically. They're not easy directions, by the way. And I'm not a theorist, but, but just shows that
I just want to add one thing here, like in Bolivia's example, it's really quite amazing. Over a decade, how the politics has changed the society and the country. But what we see in the chapter on Pakistan, which is also a very fascinating chapter by Adil Malik and co-authors, and what we see in that chapter, that these military leaders have adopted decentralization in order to strengthen their power, basically. So they are giving power to their to various political dynasts at the local level, and they raise revenue and they transfer some of those revenues back to the center. And what it has done, it has actually throttled political competition, and it has a very important implication. At the end of the chapter, these co-authors, I forgot which, I think it was chapter 8 or something, and they really discuss how it has implications for the political state the country is currently in. So it has really created all these political dynamics. These are really large families, and they started with one family, then through generations they have grown into bigger families. Sometimes a family has split, and that has actually proliferated the political space in the country, and that has throttled democracy. And although I don't know whether we should call it a proper decentralization, because as JP initiated that discussion today, that whenever he thinks about decentralization, we think about democratic framework. But here what we are talking about, decentralization, but through leaders selected by the central government. So it's not the proper decentralization. So that also needs some thinking, that why in Bolivia things change so quickly, but in Pakistan we see the same tradition continue. So this requires some thinking, and there are gaps in the literature.
Right. So I think that's the other part which is sort of missing in our theorizing, and which I think needs to be brought in, which is we think of decentralization, as JP said at the beginning, as the devolution of power and authority to lower level governments. But this devolution has implications, as you said, for national politics, right?
Exactly.
So not just at the local level, there is a flow upward from the downstream political dynamics to changing national politics and how the powers or the authority of the national government. So I think that's another thing which is not well modeled theoretically. So this is all super fascinating. So I had one further question, and then we can also discuss more. One is, we talked about this political incentives to decentralize, right? You said it's primarily a political decision, and they are trying to, the people who are doing it are political actors, and they're trying to usually achieve some political goals. But it was striking that at least in some of the case studies in the book, when you talk about the decentralization of Indonesia, of Colombia, these initiatives were undertaken after a severe economic crisis. So is there, do economic factors play a role in the decision to decentralize? Do we know, or is there, again, that's something we want to learn more about?
They can do. So as we mentioned before, the decision is political in the sense that it responds to some immediate need. And so the immediate political need might come from an economic crisis where a government seems to be responding. So they need to do something. And if they want to do something big, decentralization is a big thing. In some countries, it probably operates as a distraction, where they declare decentralization and they some bombast and some colors, but very little actually changes in the way the country is run. But it can serve as a useful tool for trying to stabilize national finances, for example, through unfunded mandates, by devolving responsibility for things, but not devolving money for those things. So they end up, really sticking it to lower level governments. Or it might be a way to try to make government more efficient. When the central state is inflexible, unresponsive, and inefficient, then one thing you can do is you can just gut it, and you can hope that it works better at local level by trying to design. And this is really the story of the Bolivian case. So Bolivia, as opposed to Colombia, Colombia definitely decentralized in the middle of an economic crisis, but they didn't slim down the state. And so then they got huge central budget deficits because the central government kept spending like before. And then you got all new lower level government spending, and it became a huge problem. Bolivia was just too poor a country. And also they decentralized in a way that was too authentic, too sincere. You know, they really did what they said they were going to do. They took money away from the central government and they passed it down to lower levels of government. And they designed those governments in very, very simple ways to be relatively transparent and more efficient than the central government had been. And so suddenly local citizens could get the mayor to do things that they could never get the government in La Paz to do, because, you know, local farmers and villagers would never make it to La Paz. They had no way of making themselves heard to the national government, but they could, you know, and I witnessed this when I was doing research a couple of decades ago of you know, mobs of villagers turning up at the mayor's office and banging on his door and saying, we have 50 families in our community, that's 300 people, we've been demanding a new school for 5 years and there's no new school, we want our school, you know, why won't you build us our school? And the mayor had to do it. And that kind of dynamic just doesn't work in a centralized country. Sorry, so I'm going on a bit, but so it can respond, decentralization can respond to economic shocks as in terms of a political exigency, a political need that needs some kind of response, where the answer might be decentralization, correctly or falsely, you know, as distraction or as a real authentic attempt to make a government more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah, in the Indonesian case also, you know, it was just a response to the change of the political regime, because Indonesia tend to have very strong local governments before 1979, before Suharto came. And then after 1998, when Suharto gone, again, there was more autonomy given to these local governments. So they went back to where they were before. So so it was a kind of response to a departure of Suharto in that sense. So so that's the thing. But, you know, there is no, as we see that, Pranab Bardhan and Dilip Mukherjee's book, 2006 book, has actually discussed this, you know, under what institutional and economic context decentralization was introduced in 8 countries. And some of the countries are common with us. And, you know, they have discussed how did that impact. So, and, you know, they have actually documented quite wide variations in the conditions of the country, in the nature of decentralization taken. Some has gone for partial decentralization, while others have gone for an all-out decentralization, and how in each case we have very different impacts. So, decentralization is a kind of generic term. You know, it really encompasses, you know, wide variations in things. And so what our book does, you know, as opposed to Bardhan and Mukherjee's earlier book, we really try to do 2 things. One is we take advantage of the development of the political mechanism, you know, which was a kind of unexplored area, you know, how politics can change, how decentralization can affect local politics, and how can that change the economic outcomes or the developmental outcomes. And the other thing we really talk about is the various innovative reforms which have been a response to address the clientelism and elite capture. And also we talk about the absolute importance of local level information, which is critical for monitoring the functioning of these local governments, and also for the accountability of the local governments. You know, and the voters can actually decide whom to vote, you know, once these local governments are settled. And it actually throws some light about the problems of limited local information. You know, some of the couple of chapters in the book actually discusses that. And, you know, they started with the ambition of doing something, you know, novel, you know, how to evaluate the local government performance. You know, there is a chapter on Ghana, and, you know, they really discuss that. And then they find that they don't get the first best information, but they still can do something to compare and contrast the functioning of the local governments in some areas. And the other thing is that, the chapter on Bangladesh also does a very important thing, is the digital birth registration records, which is very central for the delivery of various public services. And what they find that although the Bangladesh government introduced it to do it in a very limited time, they really faced a lot of difficulties, because there was problems with the local capacity, and that really hindered the progress of the digitalization of birth records. Some districts did it better than other districts, but there were actually lots of lots of mistakes in the record taking, and they have really established that using their primary survey. So local level information is another thing that we like to highlight in this book. Yeah.
Right. Now, those are fantastic. And I will just ask one final question to both of you. So before that, I urge everyone who's watching this conversation to go read this book. It has a wealth of information. It's very well written. It's very clearly laid out. Whether you're an academic, you would enjoy the survey chapters perhaps more. But if you're not an academic, many of the country experiences are really fascinating to read. So I just want to end with one final question to both of you, which is, what's a kind of dream study that you wish could have been done, but which has not yet been done? If you were, or, is there one particular country whose experiences you would like to learn more about, or some particular type of study, which I really want to know the answer to this about decentralization?
I want to know more what's happening in China, and I would like to, sorry, Sarmistha, I would love a comparative study because the Chinese have centralized and decentralized and re-centralized a number of times. By the way, parenthetically, that's normal, and we should expect that to happen because central government authorities across all systems, democracies, and dictatorships would rather wield more power than less. So a good starting assumption is that any central politician will try to unmake a decentralization, whatever they happen to be saying at the moment, right? So you should expect these waves to go back and forth. What we have is some brilliant studies of various Chinese decentralizations, but we haven't compared across them because the first round of decentralization was under a fully authoritarian regime, and the last one has an authoritarian national regime but locally elected democratic municipalities. So it would be interesting to compare across those and see how they perform differently.
And Sarmistha?
Yeah, I would really like to do a study of India. India introduced these Panchayati Raj institutions back in 1993, but, getting data on local government finances is a kind of nightmare, and it varies so much across the states. I really wanted to do a comparative study of West Bengal and Bihar. I was told that there is this website, GPMS website, where you can get the government finances. But then when I talked to Dilip Mukherjee, said that don't trust those numbers.
Oh, no.
They don't match with the local government records. So that was one problem. And then I wanted to study Bihar. Bihar, I thought that they had some really nice service during the Nitish regime they started. But I could not get hold of the data. I could not really trace anybody. So, so and India is so diverse, and, different states have adopted it differently at different points of time. I was quite amazed, what you managed to do in your paper, that, you have actually tried to get around that problem of local government finance through these different indices of this devolution. You have, depending on when they have initiated the elections and how much devolution they have done with respect to health and education. But I wish, we could really do, get a study of a few states of India, in-depth data on local government finances, local leader selection. If it would have been all in one website, that would have been ideal. And then there would be many more studies of India. I have spoken to various people, but not yet. The problem has not yet been solved. But yeah, I hope to do that one day.
right? And hopefully in time for your next book. So, but thank you, Sarmistha and JP. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating conversation, and thank you for writing a really, really interesting book.
Lakshmi,
So
can I add one thing very, very quickly? The book is free to everyone with access to a device. It's completely open access, and so we're hugely grateful to LSE Press for making it free to the world. So I just like to underline that.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.